Evening, everybody. We've managed to get hold of Lee Kerry during the lockdown. As you can see, slightly different and a bit more informal than our usual chats on the bank. But we have got Lee Kerry in his garage where all the business end of things happen in terms of getting everything set up and ready for any big events that he's fishing and whatever he's got coming up. We've got Lee. How are you doing?
Jake, I'm absolutely fine. Glad to see that we're 2 meters apart at least.
A bit further than that over in...
I've got a range of ground baits here to talk you through, and I believe we've got a load of questions, haven't we?
Yeah, so we've earlier today I've put on the social media sites for people to fire their questions across. As well as that, we're also wanting to talk about your overall preparation, how you come to decide on certain mixes. So it's not just the questions that we've had sent across, but also how you actually, the thinking behind how you get to those mixes. So for certain competitions, one in particular, the World Pairs over in Ireland, you've been over there 3 times. All 3 times you've been in the top 10, which on its own is a massive achievement. But in 2018, you actually managed to win this with partner Rob Wootton. So for that particular event, how was it that you sort of came to deciding on a mix, and what makes you come to those decisions in general in your overall fishing?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting event, actually, to be fair, to discuss, because obviously Rob and I have different bases, but the principles of our ground bait are exactly the same, like you said, as a pair after a year. So really, the first thing that always occurs to me when you go into Ireland is obviously fish meals are out. There's just no place for them in my eyes. Fish meals have in the UK, in England, should I say, are now a must on practically every venue. I haven't been to many venues where they're not. It's generally anywhere where they chuck pellets in the water, the fish become accustomed to using them, and eating that sort of bait. That doesn't happen in Ireland, so what we have to do is base our mixes around the sort of So Natural type ranges. So immediately, I need to think about the colour of the water. So the water in Ireland's very clear, so immediately I'm thinking about dark ground baits. Now, we actually do a black range, got one here, in the So Natural. So I'll hold it a little bit closer to the camera so the guys can see. That's the lake. And all of our natural ground baits, which were originally a sort of natural colour, if you like, the clearer colour, have now been darkened off. So I'm always thinking about the dark ground baits first. Now, Black River is the base of all my mixes. It's a highly based brown crumb mix, very fine. It's not particularly coarse, which I think is perfect for fishing over there. I wouldn't say it's a massively sticky mix. I wouldn't say any of the So Natural baits in the Sonubaits range are particularly sticky.
I think with river in particular, I think when people think of river ground baits, they think really, really sticky and often unmanageable. The So Natural river that's not the case, is it? It's more the ingredients that are in there that make it perfect for river fishing, rather than it just being a really sticky mix.
Yeah, it's not like an out and out big river mix. It's a mix that's perfect for the base of any river. There's brown crumb, there's like a cornmeal in there, but it's all really finely ground, so it just works really well as a base. So I use that in the black, and then we've also brought out a black roach now, which is basically a bit of a combination, really. There's some spices in there. There's a massive content of the crushed hemp in there, which for me, hemp in Ireland plays a massive part. So, those 2 ground baits combined play a really important base to my mix. So when I'm going out there, it's really awkward because you set up feeder and pole every day. So the way that I go about it is basically one mix the best I can, which tends to be the river and like half a bag of black roach. So the Black River and half a bag of black roach. And then I usually take with me another bag of black roach, and the half. So if I draw like a pole peg and I think, do you know what, I'm going to need more ground bait today, I'll mix that extra ground bait up. I don't want too much crushed hemp in my mix for the feeder. I like a little bit, whereas on the pole I like a lot, which basically means that by putting a lot of the black roach in my mix, I've got a really active mix, which on the feeder, I like a bit of activity, but not mad, not tons. So they tend to be the base of my mix, really.
So by not mixing it all up before you've arrived at your peg and not really knowing what the situation's going to be, whether it's going to be 50-50 pole and feeder or more pole, more feeder, it just gives you that option of changing your mix once you get to your peg or just before.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of, and this is a funny thing with Groundbait, I think we're always evolving on what we're doing. And I think by the end of this year, I was mixing up 2 river and a black roach every day.
Yeah.
I just like more black roach if I know that I'm pole fishing. But because I was generally feeder fishing, I was happier with those quantities. But I mixed 3 kilos because then I can use the same mix on the pole. Yeah. So it's just a little bit of play, really. Like if I was going and it was out and out pole fishing, I'd probably use 2 black roach, 1 river. I've just switched it around a bit for the feeder. And the nice thing about these ground baits are they do sort of melt away, which is, I think, is really important for your feeder. You don't want something really claggy. Yeah. So, provided you not over the active mix, so if you mix it up sort of on the morning, don't go nuts with the water. But even if you do, the high amount of brown crumb in there stops it just clagging. So it's a really nice mix that's worked. I've used that Black River. We got given it for testing about 3 years ago, I think, and I've used it pretty much exclusively as the base of my natural ground bait mix ever since. So we discussed it when we went out, didn't we, about what I'm using, and for me that Black River is the base because I know what's in it and I know how well it works as that baseline, and then you can change it with things like the bream or the roach, depending on what you're fishing for. In Ireland, it tends to be like roach and hybrids more than bream, so you don't have to worry too much about changing your ground bait to the bream, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, and how would you tend to? One of the questions we've had sent in, N. Johnson, has said, what sort of consistency do you tend to mix your ground bait? So when you get to your peg, you've mixed it up. How would you want that when it's in your tub on your side tray? Would you go to the drier side so that you can adjust it?
Yeah. I always, when I was bloodworm and joke fishing in England or abroad, I always used to go really wet. But it's totally the opposite in Ireland. You'll be adding worms, you'll be adding casters which come out of water. You might put corn in and maggots. And all those baits make your bait more moist. It also absolutely hashes it down with rain a lot of the time. So I always go on a much drier side. So sort of mix it in the morning to what I'd call like just a normal consistency, like not over wet, not dry, just mix it normal. And by the time you get on the bank, it'll be bone dry because it'll have dried out that much. And actually, Jack, I'm just going to grab a tin here, because on the pole I always sling a tin of hemp in, so there's a lot of moisture on that. So basically on that pole line it would be a damper mix, so I probably just throw the tin of hemp in, mix it around, and it makes it damp, and I've got the mix dry for the feeder, you see, so I can just work with one ground bait the whole time. You
mentioned a normal consistency, just so that people get an idea of that. Is that sort of so that you could put your hand in, one hand, give it a squeeze and it'll hold together as a little ball, but but then crumble away if you rub it between your fingers? That sort of consistency?
Yeah, it's hard to describe. I know that that's a broad term, but I think we're all accepting of what because in the past we used to be really focused on the specifics of the water, but I think now we realise you chuck this in water so it gets wet very quickly. The only reason you're changing how it is because of how it holds on things. So on a pole, but if you make it a bit wetter, you can just grab it, squeeze it with one hand, it'll be a firm ball, and you can throw it in the water. And if it's overly wet, it's sloppy, so you don't want that. If it's overly dry, it'll float. Whereas on a feeder, you're trying to get it to hold on the feeder and hold the bait in, but if a mix is drier, it breaks down much faster. So with a feeder, you want an almost instant release of your bait. So by the time it gets to the bottom, I'm not even sure how much ground bait's actually left. So that's why I would say slightly on the dry side for your ground bait.
And with that, so essentially there, so you go into Ireland, your black roach is adding some particles in, so lots of crushed hemp. You're adding on the pole line your hemp as well, so extra particles as well, whereas your river's just the consistency and the base of the mix, so the bulk of the mix, and it's got plenty in there that work and attract fish, and it's adding that black roach and the extra hemp and any other particles you mentioned, casters, corn, maggots, where you're then controlling what feed you're actually putting into the mix as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That black river is the base. Like I say, that is the base. That is the key base. The high bread content. It's got crushed hemp in it. It's got sugars in it. It's got some spices in it. It's got a slight caramel-like type flavour in it. It's a brilliant ground bait, and it's really unoffensive. It's everything that like roach, hybrids, bream want to eat. Yeah. And I can use that as a base, knowing it's really hard to ruin. It's a really difficult ground bait to mess up. So that's why I love using it over there. And, you know, it's something that I really like using. And I think more and more people are realising just how brilliant the So Natural ground baits are. So I probably won't have it to myself for too much longer.
No. And one of the things Dave Hodson has sent in as well, he has said, what's your go-to out-and-out roach mix? But I don't think we've probably swayed too far from it with what you've just mentioned there.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, it depends. If I'm bloodworm and joker fishing, I just use Black River on its own because I try to steer clear of excessive activity with bloodworm and joker because I don't want to suck in tinies. Yeah. But when I'm fishing anywhere else where I'm going to use an active ground bait to draw fishing, let's say I'm loose feeding pinky squats on a river, I just go 50-50 Black River and Black Roach. That'd be my mix. You know, it's a brilliant mix. And if I was on a big river like the River Yare, or somewhere like that, the Severn, and I just use Black Roach on its own, that'd be my mix. You know, just use that straight out the bag.
Because there's lots of particles in there, and you can get, because of the quantity of fish within them venues, you know that you can get the particles in without potentially ruining your peg bait.
Yeah, it's a coarser ground bait, and you got to remember when you're on these big venues, you're not going to ruin it with bait. Very unlikely, anyway.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, the Black Roach mix, because it's got a much higher quantity of particles than the other mixes in the range. That's why we've brought that in, because in a lot of situations that is exactly what you want.
Yeah, you know, we sort of struggled, didn't we? Were we going to call it Big Roach, Big River, you know, like Balling It Mix or whatever, and we went with Black Roach, and it just that contemplation of names makes you realise the type of mix it is. It's a coarse, manly style venue mix. Do you know what I mean? It's somewhere where I know I could mix it straight out of the bag for really aggressive style roach and hybrid type fishing, you know.
Yeah, I know that Andrew Cranston, who's obviously one of our anglers as well, he uses it on all the southwest venues, the rivers, the Bristol Avon, where you're fishing for a lot of fish, and he'll just mix that straight up out the bag. And he absolutely swears by it just because he knows everything's in there that he needs. He just catches loads of fish over it.
Yeah, and it is brilliant. It is a brilliant mix. There's a lot of the Black River ingredients are in Black Roach. It's just that Black Roach is a coarser, more active version. Yeah. So, and there's a higher hemp content in there, you know, so it changes the way it mixes. That's why I don't encourage, like, if you look at like the River as the finer option and the Black Roach is the coarse, you can judge them where you want to be, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Moving on from Ireland and World Pairs, obviously 2019, brilliant year for yourself. Probably the biggest achievement of that, Feeder Masters champion. So Tamar Reservoir, slightly different venue, loads and loads of fish. What mix did you end up going with there, and what got you to that decision?
Well, I don't think it's any secret the F1 Dark and Thatcher's combination is what I use to win. You know, we really have talked about that a lot, but I think what's quite interesting about that is how that came about. So I've had like a really good 3 or 4 years when I've been able to get on Southfield Reservoir, and I used F1 Dark and maggot fish meal. It was one of my favourite combinations. So I've got the old F1 Dark here, and I loved using that maggot fish meal with F1 Dark. But maggot fish meal isn't a particularly strong fish meal ground bait. It's quite neutral, and I caught a lot of fish on it. But I had a couple of matches where I just felt I needed to up the fish meal content.
Was that due to catching a smaller stamp than other people that maybe were putting more fish meal in, or what happened there?
Yeah, I would catch a smaller stamp, Jake, but I was catching a lot more fish and winning. But what I think was happening was people were going stronger and stronger fish meals, and my fish meal was losing its effect. So I feel like over the course of the last, 5 years ago, people at Southfield probably mixed a bit of brown crumb in, diluted their mixes off, and then it became no secret that strong fish meal was a popular choice. And I think the fish have got more of a taste for fish meal than they used to have. I honestly do think that it's evolved. So I thought, I'll try it. I'll try adding Thatcher's into the maggot fish meal. I would never change from the F1 Dark base. It's just too good for skimmers and bream. But it's too soft and light on its own. So it needs something to go with it, because it's designed more for shallow commercial venues. And although Southfield is very shallow, it tows strongly. So I didn't want something that's going to come out on impact. So I basically started playing around with Thatcher's, and it was so successful. I couldn't really quite believe it, and I thought, you know what? I want a mix where I can go Barston, Tamar, Bow Beach, wherever it was, at Ferry Meadows. It didn't matter where I went. I wanted a mix that I could understand all the time, and these two combined do that amazingly well. So my basic rules are, it'll be 2 parts F1 Dark to 1 part Thatcher's, unless it's really deep. So if the venue's a lot deeper, I always feel like Thatcher's is a lot stickier. And it increases my fish meal strength. And I always think on deeper waters, I want a stronger ground bait. Don't ask me why. It just seems to be any deep water I've ever been to, you can't overdo it with the strength of your fish meal. So I'll use it 50-50. It's pretty much what I did. So at Tamar, on the first day, I used it in equal parts because I was on a deep skimmer peg. And then on the second day, I drew an area that was really shallow where I was fishing for roach, but there's still fish meal fish. And I used 2 parts F1 Dark to 1 part Thatcher's. So basically a more dilute version that's going to break down quicker because the water's shallower. And that's the evolution of 18 months of using that mix beforehand. So when I went there, I literally took these 2 ground baits and that was it, because I was so confident they were going to work. I did take some natural ground baits in case it was that sort of venue, but it wasn't. So it was just job done, and that was it. It proved mega successful.
And I think that particular mix, as you can see, it's just behind me here, because that is one of my mixes myself. All of last year, didn't matter really where I was going. The Gloucester Canal, the Division 1 National was on the New Junction Canal, or the Aaron Calder. That ended up being our mix for the feeder, the whole team. And also places like Whiteacres, Meadowlands, that has been my mix for the last 12 months or longer. As you say, 2 parts F1, 1 part Thatcher's was generally my sort of go-to. But because of the stickiness of Thatcher's, And the fluffiness of F1, you can just tailor it with the Thatchers depending what you want. When I go down to Whiteacres, I fish little tiny sticky balls of ground bait with next to no feed in it, and just plop in a little ball for skimmers. That's during the winter silverfish festival, and that's all you need. You feed a little tiny ball like that, and sad as I am, I've timed, like, it just takes so long to break down, but you just feel like the fish come into your peg, your maggots there sat over the top of it, and the ball of ground bait's there enough time that you can catch a fish, ship back out and catch another one, and you fish out a tiny little feed. But it works just as well on natural venues as it does on commercials. It seems like natural venues are definitely going the way of fish meal. Places like the Aaron Calder or the New Junction in the Gloucester Canal, definitely, where lots of bream are getting caught. It's a brilliant mix there as well.
Yeah, it is. It's a really nice mix. It's also worth noting that mix isn't particularly coarse, which actually makes it not the best mix for the method feeder. That's where I would differ, because a lot of people said to me, like, you know, if that's all you're using, then that's all I'm using for, like, anything on feeder or pole, but not like method and pellet feeders. I want a coarser ground bait that's going to act in a different way.
Yeah. So we've got, we've actually got a question here while you're moving on to method feeders. We've got a few method feeders, quite a lot of method feeder questions got sent in. The first one we'll go with your best ground bait for fishing the method feeder at distance. So I think this leads on to a few different questions. Does fishing closer in or further away make you differ what ground bait you use if you were fishing ground bait? Or do you add anything to it if you were going to fish further on the method feeder? Anything, a binder or bait boosters, anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when you're chucking a method feeder at distance, you are putting a lot of impact into the cast, and the feeder is flying through the air at a very, very fast speed, particularly at the start. And it also is obviously hitting the water in a less controlled manner than it would be close. So everything becomes a lot more extreme. So in general, if I'm fishing at an extreme distance, I would look for a stickier mix. So, like, if I was carp fishing, for example, I'd need something really sticky, like 50-50 method and paste. It's a very coarse ground bait. If you mix any of our fish mealy ground baits on the damp side, so I would say, you know, you can squeeze them into a doughy ball, they will literally take ages and ages to break down. So it's finding that happy medium that you want. So match method mix dark or match method mix normal, depending on what the clarity of the water's like, is again the base for method feeder fishing. But if I'm going longer, I won't hesitate to go like 50-50 green, for example, which is such a coarse, strong, gritty ground bait. It's absolutely perfect for the method feeder. It really is like the most amazing method feeder ground bait, and it's one that I used with a lot of success last year, because I wanted a ground bait that would go on the feeder, stay on the feeder, but break down once it's in the water. And it's the water content that affects that more. So to try and cover all the sort of questions, I would say your ground bait, if you squeezed your ground bait into a really hard ball and dropped it in the water, it needs to break down within 90 seconds. And that is what you're looking for your method feeder, because that way you can squeeze it onto the method feeder really, really hard so it can survive impact, but the water penetrates the ground bait and then breaks it down within 90 seconds once it's there, you know, so you can then release your bait. If I'm fishing with like a match method mix is like, I would say this is what I would go for in a general shallow commercial. Let's say Lindo, for example, like Bonsai, something like that. match method mix just on its own. Match method mix dark is I prefer darker ground baits. It's just who I am. You know, I think that is the perfect mix. Whereas if you are going on deeper venues, let's say you want to fish a method at range at Berry Meadows or, you know, somewhere like that, I would go for 50-50 because it's coarser, grittier, and I know that I can really bind it on there and it'll survive all the impacts. They'd probably be my two main ones, really.
Okay, and where would pellets come into play? So would it be if F1s were the predominant species rather than carp? Would you look towards putting micros round, or where does that distinction come into play, where you would choose micros over groundbait or groundbait over micros, or a combination of both?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the basic rule is always micros first. So 2 mil pro feed, best method pellets I've ever used. Keep the shape. Fish love to eat them. You know, where I'm allowed to use pellets of my own choice, that's what I'll go for. I always think pellets are number one, but what tends to happen is I feel like groundbait comes into its own in summer. So as a general rule, creep groundbait into my method mix into the height of summer and then creep it back out again as we approach winter. It just seems like that's a really nice combination, and I think that's reflected in margin fishing. You wouldn't use groundbait down the edge in the middle of winter. It's not. It just doesn't seem to have the same effect. But you'd happily tap in a blob of micros.
Yeah.
Whereas in the summer, groundbait's got this like pulling power that I don't know where it comes from. So like at the height of summer, I'd always have like 20% micros in my mix because I think I want food there.
Yeah.
But in the summer, I would be looking at that, and then springtime, maybe like 60-40 towards pellets. You just got to play with it. Everything. There's not a golden rule, but as a general rule, I have an EVA bowl. I think I've got some here. So this is my bag down here, just off shot. So I've literally got like EVA bowls where I'll get a bowl. You can see how much prep I've been doing in isolation. These are still all stuck together with mould on, right? So I've got a bowl here. That looks like I need a clean out. I'm saving that job for the last minute. So 2 mil pellets in one. I'd have ground bait in another, and then I'd have an empty bowl, which effectively I could then work those percentages in all the time. Yeah. So I would start off with what I thought was going to be right for the time of year. Let's say if we were allowed fishing now, it'd probably be like 3/4 pellets, quarter ground bait, and then I would just play with it as the day progressed.
Yeah, and I suppose that also keeps you in touch a little bit as well. So if you're regularly going to venues and you know that the previous week 3/4 pellets to 1/4 ground bait worked, that can sort of be your starting point for the next session, perhaps.
Yeah.
And so on. And then perhaps at the height of summer, you're 80% to 20 in favour of ground bait. And then the following week it might be that, but that might not be so good. So you start winding back down again to back in favour of the pellets. Sort of just gives you that starting point to go off for your next session. Yeah,
100%. It's something that you'll learn to regulate as you go through, and you'll be amazed. Sometimes you can be fishing pellets, and I had a match at Decoy once where I was fishing pellets, and I was convinced pellets were going to be right, and I switched to 50-50 ground bait and pellets halfway through, and it was like a light. Just somebody turned the light on. It was unbelievable. Yeah. And I caught like 4 or 5, and I thought, I've got to have a go on pellets again. And literally just tailed off within 2 or 3 casts, and I added ground bait back. So it was just unbelievable what a difference that made. And that is the same with any fishing, isn't it? You know, in any bait. So
moving on from feeder fishing towards a bit of pole fishing, similar sort of topic. So catching in the edges or up to mud lines, particularly for F1s. What's the best ground bait for that sort of fishing in your opinion? I'll start with myself. For myself, I'm a big fan of Super Crush Expander. I feel like you can add a lot of water to it. You can put it in a kinder pot loose, dip your pot under, and it sort of just goes down because of the amount of water it'll take on, straight down to the bottom. The colour of it, I think, is perfect for F1s. You might be of a different opinion, but for me, for my edge fishing in shallow water, that is anything up to sort of maybe 2 foot, or up to mud lines where it can be even shallower. For me, Super Crush Expander does that job for me. What about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, look, for as long as I can remember, Super Crush Expander was my edge ground bait. You know, anything less than 2.5 foot, that was my ground bait, and I've got no reason to really change that. I'm very aware that a lot of the places that I seem to go to, you can't get in less than 2.5 foot anymore, because basically throughout time, banks have been worn away, you know, the water's deeper, you know, so as a result, I end up with looking for heavier ground baits. That's where 50-50 method and pace comes in. And I've got a few mates who go to Hayfield, and they absolutely love it. You know, they use it, and because they use it in the deep water, they think the carp are big, and it's a coarse, dark mix. They like the brown one. And I started trying it on deeper venues, and I caught a lot of fish on it. So I sort of keep those rules, really. Like if I'm going to stick, if I'm in shallow water, I just love Super Crush Expander, but it is light, and it can waft about a bit. So if I want something a bit heavier, I'll go more 50-50 because it's very, very gritty. Yeah. So, you know, once it's absorbed the water, generally speaking, it settles quicker in the peg rather than staying suspended.
Yeah. So depending on the depth, 2.5 foot or shallower, Super Crush Expander, 2.5 foot or deeper, that's when you'd look towards 50-50 method and pace.
Yeah.
Perfect. Linked to that same question, would your starting point be ground bait, or would again micros be your starting point, particularly when targeting F1s in the edges?
I think micros is always my starting point. I think ground bait is very, very good, but it blows very quickly, because if you feed too much, it's too easy to overfeed your peg. So I love having ground bait up my sleeve. So I'll start with micros and then make that adjustment to ground bait, even if it's like right at the death, last 20 minutes or something. You know, I've been speaking with starting with like hard pellets and then moving on to micros, and then moving on to ground bait.
So almost the finer particles are like a little kick to just kick the peg off again. So it's like hard pellets. You can feed very little, get a quick response on them. When that starts tailing off, introduce micros, a bit more of a response again, a smaller particle. And then if that starts tailing off, ground bait, another response. And you can sort of keep your peg going by sort of feeding smaller particles, which can cause problems, but because you're doing it progressively, you're doing it when the peg's gradually fading anyway, I suppose.
That's exactly right, and that you're using those particles to kick your peg back off again. You might think, well, why not just use ground bait from the start or micros? I just think that you can ruin a peg very easily with those small baits, and I want to use them as like an impact bait rather than the go-to bait. Whereas I find like hard pellets, you can just regulate a lot better. You know, if you're going to fish for a long time, if you're just having the last half an hour in the edge or the first half an hour across, you probably could even start straight away on ground bait. You know, if you're thinking about fishing for an hour, you might be talking about micros and then ground bait. If you're thinking this is an edge match, I've got 2 hours down here, I'd be thinking, right, hard pellets, then micros, then ground bait.
We're still on the edge theme, and we've had lots of questions about that, lots about the method feeder side of things. If you were fishing for just big carps, I'll use sort of Larford Spessy Lake as an example. You're fishing for big carp, probably not so many fish, but everyone you know is going to be potentially a double figure fish or bigger. What's your go-to mix for that?
Do you mean ground bait? Because I would, again, it is the micros element of that. But for those bigger fish on a deeper, bigger water, you just can't beat 50-50. And I love the brown version for that because it's really dark brown. I think it's a really underrated bait in the Sonu range, and it's one that I've had so much success with when it comes to big fish. But again, that's what I'm sort of talking about. They brought out a Robin Red one last year, and I used that about half a dozen times, like on features and practicing, just trying to get the mix right. Yeah. And I literally emptied it every time on it, and it sort of got my brain thinking. But for now, because I know how underused and how brilliant 50-50 is, if you put my arm behind my back, I'd definitely go with 50-50.
Yeah. And does ground bait ever come into play for you for F1? So obviously through the winter months, ground bait can come into play for myself, White Acres, at them sorts of places where it seems like you put in a little ball of F1 Dark and Thatchers and you get a response, but you're also fishing for skimmers at the same time. But as it starts warming up, does ground bait in open water ever come into play for yourself on the pole?
Not really, because I think the bottom on commercials is too soft. So I tend to focus more pellet based. It's different on a method feeder because a method feeder is a compact pile of bait every time. Ground bait is like the ultimate attractor for fish because, as a general rule, the smaller the particle size, the more powerful it seems to be at attracting fish. So if I went to a venue that was like really naff and I wanted to make something happen, effectively like what you're saying, in winter you're feeding a little ball of ground bait to get the fish to come to it. Yeah. That's because it's winter and you're trying to attract what fish are feeding. In the summer, you've only got to tap the water with your pole and they'll come and look at you. So it's slightly different. So ground bait needs to be focused on areas where the bottom is firmer. If you're on a big deep lake, for example, where the bottom is firm in open water, then by all means ground bait can be a brilliant addition. But again, the depth means that the ground bait stirs up and all the rest of it. So I think ground bait is, on commercials, is best reserved for feeders and margins. And then on bigger venues, I think it's much more prevalent in open water.
Yes, you'd look at the conditions, you'd have a plumb about, and that in regards to the edges as well. If you generally it's hard, but they're the areas that you would look to feed ground bait. It's effective at drawing lots of fish in, but if you start feeding it on a soft bottom, you're going to come into some problems, and that's where pellets, particularly hard pellets through the summer months, but even micros, expanders, hard pellets as it warms up as well. We've got one last question to wrap things up. Might be a tricky one because I'm not 100% sure if it's something that you necessarily do with this particular mix. But a message from Arnie, who has said, does Super Crush Expander mix up as a paste? If not, which Sonubaits ground baits do you like to use as a paste?
I love this question, Jake, because Joe will tell you that I've been secretly on a bit of a paste mission recently. So I was sort of determined that if I was going to come and fish commercial matches, I wanted to understand paste a bit better. Me and Joe fished it a lot like 10 years ago. Joe still fishes it, but I used to fish it a lot and have a lot of success on it. But I sort of went away from it because I was trying to understand hard pellets and I was float fishing and feeder fishing and I know how important it is. And my response to Arnie is, Super Crush Expander is a brilliant ground bait. Do not use it for a paste. It is based around expanders, so it's very light. It's not the right ground bait for a paste. By far, the best ground bait we do for a paste is 50-50 method and paste. It is hands down the best mix. The key with that mix is to mix it up a long time before. So I'd mix it really wet and I'd mix it up probably before I left the house to make sure everything was soft and mushed in it. And its paste needs to be powerful, needs to be very strong. And 50-50, particularly green, is absolutely awesome. And it's a mix that I have, like I say, I've got a lot of faith in. I'll tell you a little secret one, though, that I've been playing with for paste, and that's the barbel ground bait. The barbel ground bait we do is really, really strong and very, it's like a high oil mix, and that mixes up into an absolutely awesome paste. So, if you fancy a little gamble and having a play, then that would be the one that I would go to as my paste mix. If I've got 50-50 open, I'll use it. But from what I've found in the shadows, that barbel mix is something to be excited about.
We'll wrap it up with that. I think we've got plenty of mixes for people to go at, plenty of ideas for people to have a play around with and check out when we can get out on the bank. What I will say to people, obviously, whilst we're sort of locked up, we're in lockdown, this is a format that we're going to be doing plenty of. So if there are any specific topics that you want to cover with myself and Lee, or any of our other anglers, just comment below and let us know exactly what those topics are that you want us to cover, who you'd like us to get on as well, and we will do our best to do exactly that.